AS CIE Economics paper. Let's start. It's a multiple choice paper, so the techniques are obviously going to be very different to some of the essay writing stuff, but there's lots to learn here, and it's the same knowledge which you can be using on both papers. Today we're going to be focusing on basically making sure we've got all the theory right, as the exam's coming up pretty soon now, but also looking at how we can improve our technique in terms of answering these multiple choice questions in the best and the fastest and most accurate way possible. So let's have a look at question 1 here. So an individual has an appointment with his bank manager. He has a choice between traveling to the appointment by car or leaving the car at home and traveling by bus and then by train. The cost of the journeys are given below. Okay, given this information, what is the opportunity cost to the individual of traveling by car rather than by bus and train? So what is opportunity cost? Opportunity cost tells us something about the cost or the benefit of the next best alternative foregone. So what is the opportunity cost to the individual of traveling by car rather than by bus or train? Car, the total costs will be 4, 2, and 1, reaching a total cost of 7. Whereas the costs of a bus or a train fare would be 2 plus 3, so 5. So the opportunity cost is the cost of the next best alternative, which ends up being 7 minus 5, so $2 there. So the correct answer is A. What confirms that scarcity exists? A product has an opportunity cost. The demand for a product has risen. The government has set a minimum price for a product. The supply of a product has fallen. So scarcity exists. That's to do with us having to make choices about how we allocate resources because we don't have unlimited resources. That clearly is answer A, where we see that a product has an opportunity cost, which implies that there is some other option. There's a next best alternative, which we are foregoing when we make an economic decision. The diagram shows the production possibility frontier of a desert island economy where the inhabitants live off just 2 commodities, coconuts and fish. What explains the shape of the production possibility frontier? Okay, so we see that this PPF has constant returns. There is perfect factor mobility between the two, which means that all the factors of production are equally good at producing both. There is no cost to swapping production from coconuts to fish, and nothing is better than producing one or the other. So let's have a look. Coconuts and fish are perfect complements. That's got nothing to do with that. That's on the demand side. Coconuts and fish are perfect substitutes. Again, demand side. Inhabitants consume more fish than coconuts. We can't know that. This is just the possibility frontier. This tells us something about the potential rather than where we're actually operating at. So it must be D. The opportunity cost of fish is constant as more time is devoted to fishing. There's this factor mobility. There's this constant returns between swapping between coconuts and fish. So the answer is 3D. 4. In 2014, there was an outbreak of Ebola, a deadly disease in West Africa. People obtained information from hospitals, radio broadcasts, and notices posted by the roadside on how to prevent the disease from spreading. How can these sorts of information be classified? Okay, so this is asking us about private versus public goods. So it's easy to get misled here and think, okay, private must be, owned by individuals and public must be owned by the government. Not exactly the case. A private good is one which is excludes, one where we can exclude people, so excludable, and rivalrous. We've gone through those definitions before, but just a quick recap. Rivalry is about the fact that if one person consumes some of the good, that means there's less left for other people. Excludability is about whether you can actually stop people consuming it. So, source information. Hospitals, you can exclude people from them, so they are a private good. Radio broadcasts are harder to stop people from accessing them because you can just tune in, and they are non-rivalrous in the sense that even if someone's listening to the radio, that doesn't mean that I can't enjoy it. Same with notices, they're just posted around. You can't stop people accessing them, you can't stop other people enjoying them. So it's B, hospitals, private good, radio and notices being public goods. A rise in the price of a good is accompanied by an increase in the quantity demanded. What could explain this? Okay. So consumers spend a high proportion of disposable income on the good. The price of a complementary good is also increased. The price of the good is taken to be an indication of the level of quality. The substitute goods are all very much more expensive. Okay, so we're seeing the reverse of what we usually would expect to happen. Usual economic logic tells us that the higher the price of something, the less that people will want to demand. However, this good seems to have a positive price elasticity of demand. So we see two cases where that may be the case. We see that with Veblen goods and possibly also with Giffen goods. It's interesting to read about those two and how they kind of are very controversial in the academic community. Let's think about these factors. So consumers spending a high proportion of disposable income on the good. That means that either consumers are relatively poor or it's a necessity. It's something very expensive. If they get more expensive, then consumers are going to be going to be to afford less of it. So they're going to buy less. The price of a complementary good is also increased. That's going to decrease the quantity demanded. The price of the good is taken to be an indication of the level of quality. So an increase in the price would mean that possibly there's an increase in the quality. So the actual good has changed. So our discussions about price elasticity of demand are kind of irrelevant because that makes the assumption that we're talking about the same good and a homogeneous good. Here, perception of the good has changed, and thus actually a demand can increase when the price rises as well. So it's 5C. Substitute goods are all very much more expensive, would mean it's more difficult for people to move to other goods, but it would still mean that some people would. There certainly wouldn't be an increase in demand due to an increase in the price. 6. What causes the demand curve for an inferior good to shift to the right? Okay, let's think. What is an inferior good? An inferior good is a demand which has a negative YED. So as our income rises, we buy less of them, and instead we move to normal goods, which have a positive YED. So what causes the demand curve for an inferior good to shift to the right? A decrease in consumer incomes, a decrease in income tax, a decrease in the price of a substitute good, a decrease in the price of the good. So let's start with D. A decrease in the price of the good would be an extension. It wouldn't be a shift in the demand curve because it's about price. A decrease in the price for substitute goods, let's think. So if the price for substitute good decreases, then that would cause demand for this inferior good to decrease as well because its substitutes are now cheaper, so people are going to buy them instead. A decrease in income tax would mean that people are wealthier, and as people are richer, they're going to want to buy less inferior goods. That's the definition of an inferior good. A decrease in consumer incomes. As people become poorer, they're going to have to buy more of the inferior good, and they have to sacrifice their spending on normal, better, nicer goods. 7. In a town, bus fares fall by 50%, and this leads to an increase in bus use by 30%. The effect on car use is very low, with only a 1% reduction. Okay. What is the value of the cross elasticity of demand between car travel and bus travel? So I'm going to have to get my calculator out for this. On here. There we go. Windows Store app. Okay. So let's start first and let's think if this is going to be a positive relationship or a negative one. Well, most likely cars and buses are substitutes for each other, which is going to imply a positive XCD. So we're going to be looking out for that. Okay. The formula for cross-elasticity demand is percentage change in the price of A over percentage change in the quantity demand. Oh, sorry, other way around. Q before you P, right? So it's percentage change in the quantity of A over the percentage change in the price of B. So percentage change in the quantity is a 1% reduction. So let's do minus 0.01, and we're going to be dividing that by 50%. So divided by minus 0.5. And that presents us with 0.49. That doesn't sound entirely right. So this is the value of the cross-distance demand between car travel and bus travel. So we're seeing the effect on cars is very low, with only 1% reduction. So let's quickly check that we did our math correctly. Oh, okay, it's subtraction instead of division. Apologize for that. So let's do 0.01 divided by, yeah, I did division now, 0.5, and that gives us 0.02. And both numbers were negative, so the answer is just positive 0.02, which is C. Apologies for doing a subtraction there instead of division. In the diagram, the rectangular hyperbola DD represents a firm's demand curve. What can be deduced from the diagram? Okay. An increase in the quantity supplied, let's go to the calculator. An increase in the quantity supplied causes a fall in total revenue. Okay, what would that imply? That means that as we supply more, revenue falls. So if we shift from there to there, then the total amount of revenue would change. Actually, we see that this is a rectangular hyperbola, which implies that the demand curve is of unitary elasticity, which means that moving along, extensions of the curve will not affect total firm revenue. So it cannot cause a fall in total revenue. The price elasticity of demand decreases as we move down the demand curve. No, that's not true. It's constant. The sale of an extra unit gains no extra revenue. Correct. Total expenditure on the commodity decreases as the price falls. Again, incorrect. It's unitary elasticity because it's a rectangular hyperbola. So the answer is 8C. 9. What is price of supply? Okay, so always remember it's price and quantity and Q before P. So it's percentage change in quantity over percentage change in price. Let's have a look. The change in the quantity supplied when our price changes. The change in the quantity supplied when demand changes. The comparison of the proportionate change in supply to the proportionate change in demand. The comparison of the proportionate change in supply to the proportionate change in price. So it's going to be answer D here. And we have to talk about proportionate change in price. It's not just the total amount. We want the percentage change to make it comparable between different goods, because otherwise a good which was really expensive, you wouldn't be able to compare that to a much cheaper good. By doing percentage changes in price, proportionate change, we can actually compare the PESs of many different goods. The demand for tablets increases while the cost of producing them decreases. What will be the effect on the price of tablets and on the quantity supplied? Okay. So if we quickly pop this onto a diagram, the demand for tablets increases while the cost of producing them decreases. So if we want to zoom in here and we can even draw a little graph. So we're seeing demand curve, we see price and quantity. Always good to label all your axes. And we see demand increasing from there to there. I like to draw a little arrow there just to make it abundantly clear for the examiners which way you're moving. And then we can label our curves D and D1. And we see the price of producing them falling as well. So the facts of production have gotten cheaper. That's going to lead to supply increasing as well. So we're going to start with the supply curve there and then move to a supply curve somewhere along there, like that. And we can label these supply and supply 1. And then we can draw a little curve, these two as well. Boom, boom, boom. Now let's see. So the initial price at SD would have been over there, and we move to a new price of S1, D1. So that's not significantly different to the initial price we started at. What will be the effect on the price of the tablets and on the quantity supplied? Okay, so we know for certain that the quantity supplied will have increased, as we can see on our diagram here. Quantity supplied has definitely increased. We've gone from that here to that here. But in terms of the price, we're not exactly sure if it's increased slightly, decreased slightly, or stayed the same. So the best answer here is going to be an uncertain change in the price, depending on which one moves more, whether the cost falls more or the demand increases more, and we see an increase in the quantity. Okay, question 11. A specific tax is placed upon each bottle of perfume sold. In the diagram, SS is the supply curve before tax, ST is the supply curve after tax. Okay, so specific tax means that is in opposition to a value-added tax, means that it's a specific amount or a fixed amount for every unit sold. So every bottle of wine has a tax of £2.17, for example. And this shifts the supply curve directly up. If we have a value-added tax, we might see more interesting supply curve. This is that, and then after we add a value-added tax, it increases like that. Whereas a specific tax is going to be two parallel lines, not diverging away from each other or converging. Okay. So a specific tax is paid upon each bottle. Which area represents that part of the tax revenue paid by producers? So we always discuss the incidence of the tax. That's who the tax actually falls on and who ends up paying it. Here they're asking which area represents the part of the tax revenue paid by producers. The other thing, what will be the total tax revenue? Well, that's going to be the quantity times the amount of the tax. So the quantity is here. This is the free market quantity, W. The amount of the tax is the distant RP. You can see that because that's the amount of the increase. So we're looking for the box RWTP. Or how the name here, PRWT. However, we have to consider, are we talking about total tax revenue, or are we talking about the bit paid by the producers? How much of the incidence actually falls on the producers? Here we're asking paid by the producers. So we're going to have to look at who does this tax actually fall on. The quantity which producers get to sell has gotten smaller, but the quantity that consumers get to consume has got smaller as well. So both are worse off. The consumer surplus has fallen from this entire triangle here to just this triangle here, whereas producer surplus has fallen from this entire triangle there to just this one. Who actually ends up paying? Well, we can draw this line across from the original point, and the area above, so RQWU, this box here, or box rectangle, will have been paid by consumers, and the incidence of the box below, QPUT, will fall on producers. So we just draw that line across from Q to the original point, and then we can easily see who the incidence falls on. So this is affected greatly by the elasticities of demand. In a very, very inelastic demand situation, producers are able to pass the entire price rise onto consumers. So producers end up paying a very small incidence, whereas consumers start paying a lot. In the opposing situation where you get a very elastic demand curve, consumers are hit much harder. So the correct answer is PQUT, B. In which market would equilibrium not be achieved at point E if price were above OP? Okay, so we're looking at where equilibrium would not be achieved at point E if the price were above OP. So if the price were above OP in the price were above OP here, then we'd end up here. So there'd be a higher quantity high quantity supplied than demanded. So there'd be excess supply, and that would push the prices down. And would end up back at E. In question B, if the price were too high at some level here, for example, then again there's an excess supply. So that's going to mean that producers have to lower their prices in order to get consumers to buy their goods, because they don't want to have, their warehouses full of inventory which they're not selling. And as they lower their prices, consumers are going to want to buy more, and we're going to shift over to E. Here, consumers don't want to buy more, but suppliers buy less. Make less and less as the price falls until we reach E. Let's do D first. So here again, a very elastic demand and supply curve. So if we have a price too high, then we'll end up over here. Again, there's more supply than demand. Supply's over here, demand's over there. So excess supply only moves it down to E. In C, there's something more interesting going on. So we see a positively sloped demand curve, which is more elastic than the supply curve. So if we have a price which is too high, then there is more demand than supply, which means that we won't revert to that equilibrium because demand is higher than supply. So actually that's going to push the prices up even higher because there is excess demand. So we're not going to revert to this neat equilibrium. So the answer is 12C. 13. A company opened a garden to the public and charged for entry. The government then provided a grant to improve the garden on condition that entry became free. What would result from the government's action? The consumer surplus would increase. The demand curve would shift to the left. Supply curve would be infinitely elastic. There'd be no equilibrium position as the garden is free. Okay. So the consumer surplus would increase. Well, it certainly would, wouldn't it? Because consumer surplus is the difference between what consumers are willing to pay and how much they end up paying. So if the garden is not only better, they'd be probably willing to pay more, and it's now also free, then that means a huge increase in their surplus. The demand curve would shift to the left. Unlikely that there'd be a shift in the demand curve to the left because the garden is now nicer. So demand would shift to the right. And the fact that it's now free is an extension on the demand curve in the rightwards direction as well. The supply curve would be infinitely elastic. Infinitely elastic would mean a flat supply curve, which means that they have at any quantity and they can supply at any fixed price. That's not the case. They can't accommodate infinite numbers of people, and there is no fixed price. The fixed price is zero. There would be no equilibrium positions. The garden is free. That's not true either. You can still draw your demand and supply diagrams, even if there is no, even if the price is zero. The diagram shows the percentage of those on low pay, and there's an extremely low pay in the UK from 1976 to 2012. A national minimum wage was introduced in 1999. What conclusion is consistent with the diagram? Okay, so we see potential people on low pay, and we see extremely low pay. That falls quite rapidly after the introduction of minimum wage. However, those on low paid jobs kind of stays pretty steady, decreases slightly. What is consistent with the diagram? Minimum wage helped the low pay more than the extremely low pay. That's definitely not evident there. Minimum wage was reduced the numbers of both low paid and extremely low paid. Well, we're not entirely sure about this because this is a percentage. So, the population could have increased quite rapidly. And if it increased rapidly by more than, these numbers have fallen, then actually there could be an increase in the total number of people on low paid and extremely low paid jobs. The minimum wage reversed the trend in low pay of the previous 20 years. Okay, so there was a trend, of increasing people on low paying jobs, and this then reversed as evidence for that. And the minimum wage was responsible for the largest reduction of low pay in the period. And we're not sure about that. There could be other factors behind it. So the only one really here is the minimum wage reversed the trend in low pay of the previous 20 years. So we see this trend of it increasing on both sides, and then it's starting to fall. So 14C is the best answer here. A 10% tax is placed on a good. What type of product would be most likely to face the biggest impact on its equilibrium price as a result? Okay, so 10% tax is placed on the good. This is a value-added tax. We're seeing these diverging supply curves now. And what type would be most likely to face the biggest impact on its equilibrium price as a result? So one with elastic demand, producers are going to be desperate to not pass that on to consumers because it's going to mean massive falls in the quantity demanded. One with inelastic demand, well, you know what, consumers are willing to pay higher prices anyway. They're not too affected. So that seems the most likely impact. And one with infinitely elastic demand, infinite elasticity of demand. Let's have a look how that would look. That'd be just a flat line. So 10% tax is placed on that good, then that's going to be a direct increase in the price of the good, meaning that there is a huge, so let's draw this out. Okay. So infinitely elastic demand, another supply shifted up. So there's a big fall in firm revenue and no increase in price. If, however, we see perfectly elastic, I think was the perfectly inelastic. Here, there's a huge increase in price. So the entire tax is passed on in the form of high prices to consumers. And unitary elasticity of demand is going to be somewhere in between, where there's no change in revenue, so there's just some degree in increase in price, but not massive. And elastic is going to be closer to the infinite elasticity. So the correct answer is B, one with inelastic demand. In 2009, the Austrian government made a payment of 900 those who earned less than $100,000 per year. Okay, Australian, sorry, not Austrian. This is kind of a universal basic income. How would the effect of this transfer payment be described? Neutral, progressive, proportional, regressive. So regressive would mean that the poorer are hit harder than the richer. Proportional would mean that it's kind of fixed, so everyone pays, for example, 10%, and that means the richer give more than the poorer. Then you have a progressive taxation system, which gives the rich paying not just more proportionally, but even more. So they might pay higher rates of interest. So, for example, poor might pay 10%, and then the rich might pay 30%. So not only more at a nominal rate, a nominal figure, but also more of their total salary as well. And neutral is kind of that there's no welfare transfers. So for 16, it's clearly being targeted at the poorer people, only those who earn less than 100,000. So it's going to be B, progressive. Here we see the market for wheat. If the government wishes to fix the price at OP, what quantity of wheat must the government buy? Okay, so it's trying to get the price to OP2. That would mean they're going to have to increase demand to this line here, which would be an increase in demand of this distance here. So let's have a look at what height that would be. That'd be this height there to there, which in fact is exactly equal to this height here. And if we want to think about how this would look on our diagram, then that would be at a quantity level, the distance x to z, because we want to be operating here. Which means the increase would be some distance there. And there is a trick that you can see that's the distance x to z, because you want it at this price here. where that demand curve crosses that price level there. So the distance you're going to want to increase it by is from there to there, because that's going to be the excess supplied at that price, and that's the amount that you're going to want to buy up. So it's X, Z, C. As part of a privatization policy, a government deregulates bus services and sells off its public sector bus service to the private sector. What is least likely to occur following these changes? Okay. It's a privatization policy, deregulates bus services and sells off its public sector bus service to the private sector. Bus fares are increased. That could happen. Bus service companies invest in new buses. Could happen. Extra bus service companies enter the market. Could definitely happen to come and compete with the new companies. Loss-making bus services are retained. Now, this is unlikely to happen because whereas government will be happy to fund loss-making services because they may be of societal benefit, the private sector will not because there's a profit incentive, so they're not going to be retained. 18D. Okay, some complicated AS diagrams here. Keynesian. A government decides to reduce income tax and increase sales tax. The initial diagram point is shown by X, the diagram AD and AS will be equilibrium point after these tax changes. So, an increased sales tax is going to shift AS because that's a tax on production and on sales. It's the same as a specific tax or a value-added tax on the micro level. Here in macro, it's going to be a shift on the AS curve. So moving from AS to AS1, which gives us either the option of C or D. And let's have a think. So reducing income tax is obviously going to boost disposable income, make people wealthier, which could increase spending. So we're going to see AD shifting to AD1, AD1 intersecting with AS1, leading to point C, 19C. The table gives data for an economy. In which year did real GDP decline compared with the previous year? So we want the real GDP here. This gives us current prices, so just at a nominal level. 200, 220, 240, 300, 320. So it's increasing every year at a nominal level. Let's have a look at a real level. So there's a 9% inflation here, whereas GDP increased by 10%. Here, the GDP increased by 40 over 220, so 4 over 22, so 2 over 11, so 5.5%. Let me just check my maths there. Whereas inflation was much, much larger. We can see inflation and obviously in the exam you'll have a calculator, you won't have to do it like I am doing, but it seems pretty obvious to me so far that this increase is not matched by this increase. There's going to be a real GDP declining there. So let's have a look. We're going 240 minus 220, leaving 20 divided by 220. So there's a 9% growth in the economy, whereas inflation has increased, and these are index numbers. So starting on the price of 100, then 109, 125, which means they're very easy to work with. And you can just divide one by the other. We see that inflation is 15%, so much larger. So there's going to be a decline, and which means that it's going to be the period in what year? Okay, so this is that year. This is grew in this year. However, it shrunk in B, 2012. What always happens when there is an increase in the CPI? An increase in consumer expenditure, an increase in the cost of living, reduction in living standards, reduction in real disposable income. Okay, increase in consumer expenditure, maybe, but seems unlikely, right? Higher prices means that people will probably choose to spend less. An increase in the cost of living, well, that's the definition of the CPI, isn't it? CPI is a measure of a basket of goods which we can buy in shops. And if that increases, gets more expensive, then that is by definition an increase in the cost of living, because the cost of living is defined as the inflation and the purchasing power parity. Reduction in living standards, possibly, but if it's accompanied by rapid growth, then we won't see that. And it's the same with disposable income, because if it's accompanied by rapid growth, we won't see that. So it's going to be 21B. What would identify a country with a fundamental balance of payments disequilibrium? Okay. Alternates, annual deficits, and surpluses in the current account. Okay, so that's not a fundamental balance of payments. A fundamental balance of payments means kind of persistent, and in the long run, there is some disequilibrium, so either some surplus or deficit, rather than it wavering between the two. Continually growing balancing item, that's absolutely fine as long as the overall balance stays at or near zero. A large short-term outflow of foreign direct investment, where you see it's here at short-term, so it's not going to be a fundamental issue, and its FDI could be met by lots of lots of exports. Sorry, a persistent rise in foreign currency reserves. Well, there you go. That's going to be an improvement in the. That's going to be a very good balance of payments position, which means it's in disequilibrium because it's not in a imbalance. So 22D. At present, 1 unit of a country's currency exchanges for $1.2. The country aims to set its exchange rate at $1. They're trying to peg their currency. If we remember the policy trilemma, we can choose between having free capital flows, autonomy over our monetary policy, like interest rates, or being able to set pegs for exchange rate. We can't have all three. We can only have two. Which combination of government actions in the foreign exchange market must achieve this aim? So the currency is too weak at the moment. It's too strong at the moment because they're able to buy $1.2 and they only want to be able to buy $1. So they have to weaken their currency. They can do this by selling their own currency and buying US dollars, buying US dollars will strengthen US dollar. And selling its own currency will weaken it because of they're basically decreasing demand for their own currency and increasing supply. So that's going to lead to a fall. So that's going to be B here, buying US currency and selling its own currency. That weakening could be positive for the balance of trade position. And that's why some countries choose to peg their currencies at an artificially low level, like this country seems to want to do. The diagram shows the exchange rate for the UK pound in terms of US dollar. The original equilibrium rate is at X. What will be the new exchange rate equilibrium of the UK pound following a rise in UK interest rates? Okay. So what we see is that demand for the UK pound is going to increase. Let's think why that might be. Due to hot money flows, so huge amounts of financial capital, which is run by asset managers and pension funds and hedge funds who want to basically save their money in banks with the highest interest rates. They move their money around, save their money in banks with the highest interest rate to try to get the best returns for their investors. If there's a rise in UK interest rates, then they're all going to flood into the UK and try to save their pounds, save their money in UK banks because they achieve a higher interest rate. That's going to increase demand for the pound and decrease demand for the US dollar, because overall the less people want US dollars because instead they're going to want pounds. How is supply of pounds is affected? Well, it's not affected massively because this is more about foreign currency coming into the UK. People are not going to decide to supply their pounds more or less. So we're going to move to a higher demand but the same supply. So we're going to move to point A. So 24A. A country's terms of trade increased from a base year value of 100 to 120 in the following year. If export prices had increased by 50%, what was the change in the price of a country's imports? So, how do we define the terms of trade? Well, it's the average price of exports over the average price of imports. So if it increased from a base year to 100 to 120, that means that the average price of exports is increasing. If export prices increased by 50%, what was the change in the price of the country's imports? So we'll see that imports have increased as well, but not by as much. So we're going to have an equation where we see 20%, because it's increasing 20%, equals 50% divided by x, and we want to figure out what x is. So we can swap these two. We can do 50 over 20, leading us to a 25% increase. And then let's check if that's right. Then we've got 50% over 25% is going to be, 0.5 over 0.25 is going to, let's get our calculator just to make sure we're doing all this correctly. Import price increase by 5 divided by 0.25 is 100%. Sorry, where am I going wrong here? Export prices had increased by 50%. What was the change in the price of the country's imports? Okay. Oh yeah. Okay. Sorry. So yeah, we see that there's a 20% increase in the terms of trade, which implies that there must have been an increase in the price of imports as well, but not as large as the increase in the price of exports. So let's try these four solutions. These two are decreases, which would have meant that this 50% was amplified, so it would have been larger overall. If there were a 30% change, then it would have been, let's do it like that, just to keep it more accurate. Basically doing 1.5 divided by 1.3. So we're seeing that's 1.15, that's not accurate. Instead we're seeing 1.5 divided by 1.25. And that's equaling 1.2, which is that 20% increase. Okay. So yeah, you have to use 1 point, not just 0. In each country, P and Q, one person can either produce the quantity of X or the quantity of Y. In which case does country P have absolute advantage in the production of Y and country Q have comparative advantage in the production of X? Okay, so about absolute and comparative advantage. Now remember, absolute means you can produce it at a lower overall cost, a lower production cost, whereas comparative advantage means you can produce it at a lower opportunity cost. In each country, P and Q, one person can either produce the quantity of X or the quantity of Y. So this is how much they can produce, either 6 or 7, and country Q can either produce 6 or 9. So we want absolute advantage in the production of Y for country P. Yes, they have absolute, sorry, no, this is how much they can produce. So they do not have absolute advantage there because they can produce less. Same in this case. In this case, they can produce more, so they have an absolute advantage. So it's either C or D. Now let's have a look at comparative advantage. That means that their opportunity cost is lower. So here, for if we're looking at C first, country P, the opportunity cost of producing 1 unit of X is half a unit of Y. We can see that by dividing 6 by 12. And their opportunity cost here is also half a unit. So there's no possibility of having comparative advantage here. So it must be D. Let's check that. Here we see 16, so we see 15 divided by 16 versus 8 divided by 14. So very obviously, 8 divided by 14 is going to be a smaller number than 15 divided by 16. So they have comparative advantage. They have a lower opportunity cost. So 26D. A government removes the tariff on a product as shown in the diagram. Okay, what will be the change in domestic production? So we're moving from this world supply here to this world supply there. Will be the change in domestic production. Initially, domestic production would have been here at W. Now that's going to fall to V. It's a reduction of V to W. A. We know this to be true because world supply with tariff, where this line intersects the supply curve here, at all quantity below that, that means that domestically we can produce it at a lower price, so that's going to be produced domestically. Anything above, it's going to be at a higher price. So at this fixed world price, we're going to see operating at W, and then without the tariff, that causes the price to fall because there's no cost on importing it. So that's going to fall, and actually domestically we're going to produce this triangle here, V. What would be increased by an expansionary fiscal policy? Budget deficit, exchange rate, money supply, direct rate of taxation. So expansionary fiscal policy means a decrease in taxation and an increase in government spending. So this is incorrect. Money supply and exchange rate are both monetary policy tools, so they're not going to come under fiscal policy, and which only leaves us the budget deficit. So if an economy is spending more than it receives in tax receipts, that's only going to get worse if it, lowers tax and decides to spend more in an expansionary fiscal policy. So 28A. Of course, the exception to this is this idea of the Laffer curve. So famously drawn on the back of a napkin and is now a hallmark of Republican policy, that here, if we put the tax rate down at the bottom here, and we put total tax revenue, we know that at a tax rate of 0, total tax revenue will be, do as quick as possible, will be 0. And if we have a tax rate of 100%, all income you earn is taxed away. No one will work because there's no point in doing it. So total tax revenue would be 0 as well, which means that there must be some curve like that. As the tax rate increases, we'll get more tax revenue, but up until some point, because here, if you keep increasing the tax rate to 80, 90, 100%, people are going to be less inclined to work, so total tax revenue can actually decrease. The question sidesteps this by asking, by talking about expansionary fiscal policy. Expansionary fiscal policy necessitates a decrease in tax receipts because it means either lowering or raising the tax rate in such a way that money is injected into the economy, so total tax receipts are lowered. Okay, penultimate question. Possible policies the government might use to reduce the deficit on the current account of the balance of payments include devaluation, government spending cuts, interest rate rises, and tariffs on imports. Which two policies could be classified as expenditure switching? Okay, so expenditure switching, you're aiming to get consumers to buy goods that are produced domestically instead of produced on the world market. So how could they use this to reduce the deficit on the current account by devaluation, government spending, interest rates, and tariffs and imports? So devaluation and government spending cuts. A devaluation of the currency is going to mean, yes, more is spent on more spent locally, more spent domestically, so fewer imports and more exports. But government spending cuts are going to mean that the economy shrinks overall, and are going to mean that the government is actually spending less things, so AD is going to fall. Government spending cuts and interest rate rises. Both are very contractionary policy. Interest rate rises and monetary. Government spending cuts are fiscal. Both those two together will cause AD to fall. Interest rate rises and tariffs on imports. Interest rate rises and tariffs on imports. So tariffs on imports are going to cause that improvement in the reduction in the deficit again on the current account. But interest rate rises would firstly counteract the tariffs on imports, because the currency is going to get stronger again, which means that the goods become less competitive. So imports will decrease and exports will imports will increase and exports will decrease. Tariffs on imports and devaluation. Those are two policies which are definitely going to reduce the current account, because devaluation is going to do that, and tariffs on imports will do that as well. And those are going to cause consumers to buy more goods domestically. So 29D. Final question. In March 2014, Sweden had a change in its consumer price index CPI of minus 0.6. We're seeing some deflation here. Which combination of policies might the government use to restore price stability? Increase interest rates? No. If we increase interest rates, borrowing becomes more expensive. So let's quickly think what the transmission mechanisms are for interest rates. First, we have how consumers are affected. So they're affected in three ways. Variable rate mortgages become more expensive to pay back because interest rates on them rises, which means they have less disposable income to go and spend on the economy. So that's not going to increase AD. So that's not going to restore the inflation to where it was before. We're going to see the opportunity cost of spending rising because now you can earn more in the bank. And we're going to see the cost of borrowing for, credit cards and that kind of thing rising as well. So that's going to lead to less being spent on them. Firms often fund a lot of their investment through borrowing, especially on the bond market for larger firms or with banks for smaller firms. So that's going to become more expensive, which is going to make more projects not worthwhile. So they're going to invest less and fall in AD again. At the same time, we're going to have hot money flows coming in with higher interest rates. So that's going to lead to a worsening of our exchange rates and a fall in the balance of payments position, which is going to worsen X minus M, which is going to worsen AD once more. The last two transmission mechanisms are to do with expectations. So because of all these things, because of AD falling, expectations are going to be that the economy is going to shrink. If the economy is going to shrink, then that means that there's going to be less consumer confidence, less business confidence. So firms are going to spend less, firms are going to hire less people, consumers are going to spend less, they're going to choose to save their money in case the economy gets even worse. And the final transmission mechanism is the wealth effect. So asset prices generally fall in a higher interest rate environment. This is because the higher the interest rate, the less attractive it is to go and put your money in risky stocks and housing and things like that. So there's going to be less demand for them, so their price is going to fall overall. So an increase in interest rates is certainly not going to increase aggregate demand or increase or decrease aggregate supply in such a way as to boost CPI. Increasing direct taxes is just going to be similarly contractionary. Increasing interest rates and reducing government expenditure, increasing interest rates, no. Reduce government spending, that's not going to help either. Reduce interest rates, that's going to be expansionary, and increase government expenditure, that's going to be some Keynesian spending there, hopefully causing the multiplier effects, possibly accelerated effects afterwards. All this kind of thing is going to be beneficial to the economy, is going to boost AD, and that's going to get Sweden back into a region of price stability. Okay. Yeah, thank you all very much for listening into this broadcast. If you have any questions, do go and ask me on the ZCoach Slack. Thank you very much, and see you next week.